So first off, thank you everyone for joining today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy days to come and hear our webinar from Skan and iGrafx, from compliance to AI, where we're going to be talking about how you can harness the power of digital twins to move forward your operational excellence, risk and compliance, and other initiatives within financial services. A couple housekeeping notes before we jump in. First, for the duration of the webinar, everyone's going to be muted. If you do have any questions, we certainly encourage them. We have time booked at the end for Q&A, so please add them to the Q&A button on the Zoom webinar panel rather than the chat. It'll just make it easier for us to manage them, and we certainly appreciate it. Second, the webinar will be recorded, and we'll send out a recording after it's finished. So if you do have to drop, we hope you can stay with us for the entire time, but if you do, we will be able to get that to you. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and kick it off. We'll start with the agenda for the day. So we'll do an introduction to Brian and myself. Then we'll talk a little bit about the digital transformation imperative that we're seeing in organizations across the board, but particularly in financial services. Some of the things we've observed in the market about digital transformation initiatives, what's causing them to succeed or fail. Talk about what the art of the possible can look like for your company as a financial services organization. And then we'll talk about how you get there, which is really kind of predicated on this notion of the digital twin, which we'll explain in a little bit more detail and how it works and how you can get to that art of the possible. And then at the end, we'll kind of give you a little bit of recommendation for the different areas that you might choose as a starting focus, because building out a digital twin is a gradual process. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, like I said, at the very end, we have time booked for Q&A, so please add your questions to the Q&A panel. We will be sure to answer them. So with that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Max Smith. I'm a Senior Director of Product Marketing here at iGrafx, and I'm joined by Brian. Brian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Great to be here. I'm the Director of Product Marketing as well over at Skan AI.
So we're same person, different companies is a good way to look at it. Brian, so happy that you could be here. This is our first joint webinar together, hopefully of many to come. So super excited to walk through this with you today.
Absolutely. All right.
So let's jump into the content. I talked a little bit about that digital transformation imperative, right? And the reason that it's important is because if you look at particularly some of the biggest companies in the world, for instance, if you look at the average lifespan of S&P 500 companies, 80 years ago, they lasted for 67 years. But today that's dropped tremendously down to about 15 years. So what that means is competition is getting stronger. There's more customer demands in the market. We're going to talk a little bit about those market factors that are driving this. But effectively, companies find themselves needing to reimagine how they do business in order to effectively compete. And digital transformation is really maybe the key lever to help organizations get there. And some companies are embracing that challenge of digital transformation, and they're putting in the work to transform themselves. If you look at some of the winners and the losers in the financial services space, you can see, Bank of America, Navy Federal Credit Union, USAA. They're all investing in technology aligned to improving customer experience, improving customer expectations, which is having a knock-on impact in the top line and the bottom line for their businesses. Some of them, they've been reviewed by analysts. They've received many awards. They've done well in terms of the customer experience index surveys, even beating some non-financial institution companies, which is very difficult to do, admittedly, for the financial services industry. But if you look at the flip side, we've seen some big losers over the past year or two here. Companies like Signature Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, Credit Suisse that have all folded because they don't really have visibility in what's going on, and they're not aligning their transformation efforts appropriately. And so one change, something like COVID, can really be the tipping point that turns something that's ineffective into something that's catastrophic. So if we dive in a little bit more and talk about some of those factors that are impacting digital transformation, and again, the various components of that, like compliance, like new technology, like operational excellence, right? We see a couple different trends. The first is customer experience, and this has always been something that's important, right? But in today's market, there's such a demand for hyper-personalization, for differentiated experiences, and the technology that exists has really enabled us to offer these new experiences, right? So we're at a point where even though this isn't new, it's more urgent than ever, and the customer demands are higher than ever. Also, internally, to meet those demands, there's a war for talent. It's particularly good talent, right? There's fewer people to do the work that you need to do, and so you're competing with other financial services and organizations to get that talent in. Obviously, technology plays a huge factor in this. What new technologies are available? Automation has been huge for a while. Automation has been redefining how companies are doing business. Right now, the hot button one, I'm any tech webinar you watch is going to talk about AI in some capacity, right? So AI and potentially Gen AI is really popular right now, and companies are trying to figure out how do we actually use this and align it to the outcomes that we want for the business? Because what we see is a lot of companies that are kind of just blindly throwing it at different places, seeing if it sticks, and hoping that they get the right outcome. It's a solution looking for a problem rather than the other way around. And we'll talk about how to change that thinking a little bit later. The next one, certainly for financial services, right? There is no industry that's more regulated than financial services, and that regulatory landscape is constantly shifting. There's constantly regulation on the desks of your local governmental body, whether that's Parliament, Congress, or something else. And then lastly, sustainability goals. And this is particularly important, not just to do the right thing by the planet, but also from a financial perspective. Investors in companies, customers, investors, people that do business with you are demanding that you have these practices in place to operate sustainably. And so that's caused a lot of companies to re-examine how their operations work. And then lastly, just this probably goes without saying, but none of this is static, right? The problems of today might not be the problems of tomorrow, and there are constantly changes that are happening. What is the next new technology after AI? What is that next piece of regulation that's sitting on the desks of government? And so we want to be ready to make sure that these digital transformation efforts aren't just a point in time, but they're also fostering a culture of continuous improvement. And Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like, like you said, digital transformation is not a new concept. But we are at an inflection point and technology is changing fast. And you really can't afford the same old trial and error and just keep failing. I mean, this is a pretty telling stat from HBR about the high level of percentages that digital transformations are just not meeting their goals. So companies are trying things. I mean, there's certainly no shortage of attempts to change how organizations work. I'm sure everybody on this webinar has gone through it in some way, shape, or form. And again, it's not for lack of trying. I mean, there's been a lot of technology shifts over the last few decades, whether it's cloud computing, automation was all the rage about a decade ago. I mean, everybody was rushing to the RPA space here too. And now, generative AI has changed it once again. And a lot of the same methods that we've kind of gone through in the past may or may not actually work going forward. So, as we're constantly looking at how we're managing workforces, so sometimes that looks like layoffs, offshoring, and then different ways of working model. But people have tried a lot of different things, especially in the people department. But I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that you do have a process problem. Fundamentally, to make lasting, meaningful change, you really need the most clear and accurate picture of how people work. And that is a process function at the end of the day. So if you go to the next one here, you know, the value proposition that all companies are trying to reach, really, it tends to fall into one or more of these buckets in reality, right? Everyone's trying to do more with less. Cost takeout, cost reduction, put your flavor on it. But the reality of it is people are trying to do more with less. And that has sometimes direct impacts on customer experience. But, how do we serve customers faster? Obviously, it looks like resolution time. That could be customer service. That could be onboarding, getting through the KYC process faster is a really important part of that. And we're also looking for, ways to add automation, right, as a way of tackling that problem here. So really trying to, increase those return on investments is a big part of how do we increase, cost reduction, but ROI on what we're doing too. Reduction in time spent on cases here, right? Everybody has a happy path. Everybody knows that, your agents and your operators and your frontline support are supposed to follow a very specific path. But, actually holding people accountable to that is a real challenge because the better your operators are able to adhere to a process, typically the better the customer experience is. You typically know how it's gonna, how processes should be carried out so you can operate most efficiently. But having data to back that up to show where your staff and your operators are actually doing that well or not is definitely a big challenge here. But fundamentally, we're trying to get to that high percentage reduction in time spent on cases because we know that also equals savings. Banking specifically, you've got a real challenge here in the regulatory and SLA, right? So it's not just compliance monitoring, but that KYC process of how customers not just come through the door the first time. So KYC isn't just onboarding, right? There's also that refresh process that happens on either a schedule or an ad hoc basis. But that regulatory compliance process is really important. And being able to not just track how that's being carried out, but being alerted for non-compliant activities, making sure agents are not, using applications they shouldn't be using. And how do we actually add some alerting around that? Because at the end of the day, enhancing regulatory compliance is quickly becoming a C-level objective and something that all banking companies really have to pay attention to. So how do we increase that compliance rate without adding overhead? I think is a big challenge here. And then CSAT and NPS, right? You're always trying to increase the customer experience. That's a given there. Process standardization is a big piece of that. Everyone has some measure of CSAT, NPS, customer satisfaction surveys, like it's all in there. So how do we increase that while still, reducing costs, reducing the time spent, increasing our compliance is always a big challenge there. So we fully recognize that, everybody that's in process transformation has a big task in front of them, especially in banking and financial services. So, there's a lot of ways of adding value, but this is typically where we see people trying to affect change. Let's go to the next one.
Absolutely. And I'd say so we've established, right, it's a process problem. And as Brian mentioned, those are kind of like the levers or the key targets, the things that we're trying to improve through the process. And I think that mind shift is so important because again, there has been so much technology, there have been so many ways that we've tried to change people around, and we're still getting to that 87.5% number, right, where it's not working. So process is clearly the focus point to be successful, and that's what we've seen in the industry. I think both in dealing with the customers that we both service and the people we've talked to. Also, I think I don't think I know this is what the analysts are saying as well, right? So for those of you that might not be as familiar with process, I want to take a minute to talk a little bit about digital twins. So digital twins are basically virtual replicas of your ongoing operations in the business. So this could be of the various processes that that run through the organization, of the people, of the technology, of the objectives, strategies, and goals that your companies have. We want a virtual model that represents reality. So first of all, we can kind of measure what the problems are, but also so that we can tweak it a little bit. So as we look at what I want to do on this slide is take a look at that process improvement lifecycle and kind of break it down into 3 discrete steps that are a little bit easier to chew on. And then we can go a level deeper and explain kind of how it works for those steps so you can get to those outcomes. So the first step in this transformation process is discovery. You need to understand how your processes run today, create that baseline understanding of what's going well, what isn't going well. For that, you need visibility, right? You need to see exactly how the operations work across people, across systems, and everything else. And with that visibility, you can start to uncover those inefficiencies that exist, where there are bottlenecks, opportunities for improvement, the things that are dragging down those measures that Brian just mentioned. And also to uncover failure points in implementing controls. Like Brian said, again, compliance is a huge topic in financial services, right? And it's more present now than it ever has been because I feel like as a whole, the world is more regulated now than it ever has been, right? And so you want to know if you do have controls. First of all, if you don't have controls in place, you want to know where those instances exist, and if you do have controls, you want to make sure that they're working. Once you have an understanding of what's happening in reality, the next step is to design how you want the future to look like. What are what does good look like for these processes as you're reinventing them? And to do that, you're going to need a lot of collaboration between different teams, right? IT is going to have a say, business is going to have a say, process professionals and centers of excellence are going to have a say. The second line of defense, your risk officers are going to have a say. So we need to take that information we have from that digital replica, inject the opinions and perspectives of these different teams, and create that future state together and make sure it's risk informed and make sure it's geared for performance. A big part of that is being able to quantify what impact a change is going to have. So if you hire people, if you implement automation, if you add Gen AI, we want to know, is that going to have the return that we expect? And this is part of why a digital twin is so important, because you don't want to make that change in reality. You don't want to just invest in something and see if it works. You want to be able to prove it out beforehand. And as part of that proof, you can also test to say, if we add something new, are we going to remain compliant? And then lastly, as you're executing those change management programs, once you've said, here's where we want to get to, and we start moving to that in reality, you're going to be executing continuous improvement based on those opportunities, based on the changes that you want to make. And you also want to make sure that you're safeguarding against new risks. I mean, things happen. Departments change, layoffs happen, reorgs happen, people quit that you might not know about. And so as those things are happening in real time, you need to evaluate, are these changes going to materially impact the change management programs that I'm running? So let's break that down kind of piece by piece, discover, design, optimize, and let's talk about how the digital twin works to support each of those. And so we'll start with discover. And I think importantly, actually, you know what, Brian, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, we can get going here. So Discover obviously is a big piece of how you get started. Kind of like we've talked about, you can't really make meaningful change without first understanding how people work. And that's probably the biggest component of why the digital twin model works so well for digital transformation here. So our goal is to create the most complete view of any process across every application. And this is where Skan and iGrafx coming together really presents a real opportunity to get that most complete view. And, I'll let Max talk a little bit about the iGrafx solution at Skan. We start with observation on the desktop. We want to see what applications people use, how they're switching, really get a full picture, not just on process steps, but also technology that they're using. And I think that's a big piece of, how you can make informed decisions, especially in this discovery phase, as you're really trying to get your head around exactly how people are working, where are those bottlenecks, and really look at, how you can affect process performance, but by first starting with a baseline. You want to talk a little about iGrafx here?
Absolutely. So I think uh, that human element is so important, first and foremost, right? Like what you're doing at Scan and understanding what people are doing, on their desktops, what applications they're using, where the switches are happening, where time is being wasted, and where we're opening ourselves up to compliance risks, right? iGrafx definitely complements that from the systems view as well. So there are core systems that you use in financial services. Think of your core banking systems or your ERPs or your CRMs or human resources systems, right? They all generate digital footprints of what's happening. And with iGrafx, we can automatically interpret that into process maps visually, but also run the analysis on top of that. And the reason it's so important, iGrafx and Skan together for this is when you think about your actual operations, this goes across, things that are happening on system, off system, the people that are moving around, talking together. There's so many facets to this. And so together, providing that complete visibility is really important to generate that baseline for the digital twin, right? And I just wanted to note one thing specifically for financial services, because you might think, well, can we do this analysis, right? There's lots of regulation and privacy concerns and things like that. And the short answer is that both Scan and iGrafx have tools and configurations in place to meet those compliance needs and ensure that, for instance, if you're in an area where you can't go down to the human level or an individual level, or if you don't want to go down to an individual level, you can do analysis based on cohorts. You can anonymize data. There's certainly policies and technology and policies in place to do things like encrypt data and anonymize it and protect PII. So we haven't run into an issue, either one of us, where that's really been an issue. But I can imagine asking that, giving this presentation to financial services organizations, that question might be top of mind. I think the other thing that I want to mention here before we move on is, if you try to do this without technology like Skan or iGrafx, what does that look like? Like, what have people been doing previously, right? Because process improvement isn't new, digital transformation isn't new. And what that looks like is typically just walking around and talking to people and saying, "Hey, how do you do your work?" Right? The old model of like carrying around a stopwatch and or getting people in a room and whiteboarding with a bunch of sticky notes. And the challenge there is, if you ask five people what the process looks like, you're going to get 20 different answers. Like, it's just not consistent. It's subjective. People typically have a limited view only into the scope of operations, like what applies to them. So like you have problems scaling this understanding. And so it's important to use technology to get that objective view into what's actually happening that really isn't up for debate, because the data is showing that this is what's actually happening. So it's more accurate, but it's also quicker. Who wants to spend time walking around with the stopwatch or getting people together, having one more meeting, doing the whiteboarding sessions? So the value proposition here is you can establish that understanding of what's going on today much more quickly than if you didn't use technology to support those initiatives. So then we have that baseline, right? And as I mentioned, the next step is design. Like, where do we want to go? What does that ideal golden version of the process looks like? And we have that starting point from the technology that we just talked about with Skan and iGrafx. So a lot of people start with a BPMN model. If you're not familiar with it, it's a common modeling notation that basically represents a visual map of a process. If you look at the diagram in the middle, that's kind of what a process map would look like. You might be familiar with these if you've used like Visio, Lucid. You've probably seen a process map before. We can automatically generate those from the data that we gather from both of our systems. And not only that, also operating procedures, work instructions. I'll let Brian talk a little bit more about that in a second. But once we have that map, right, that's just a picture. So we're still not quite there. We want to contextualize that with the rest of the business. So who are the people involved? What are the systems involved? What are the strategies that we're optimizing for? What are the measures that we're using, the KPIs that are important for this process? What are the risks associated with it? And what are their mitigating controls? So we want to build the business context around that process in such a way that as we're making the tweaks, we can see what impact they're having. Or we can say, if this department loses two people, what are all the processes that this department touches, so we can get a better idea of the impact. So contextualization is a huge part of that. And to test those hypotheses, process simulation is also a huge part of that. So this is a technology where once you have that model, you can start applying changes and understand the impact across all of those metrics that Brian was talking about. Understand what the impact on cost is going to be, on productivity, on things like cycle times, onboarding rates, and on things like compliance. And it's again a great way to test these changes in a without risk, because you're not investing, you're not spending any money on changes. You're evaluating what impact they're going to have in this digital twin, this digital replica environment. And importantly, for simulation to be effective, the baseline data has to be effective. So we talked about Discover a second ago, and we said we have that automated, accurate record of what's actually happening. Well, that's important, because if you ask people what's happening and your base diagram's off, any of the changes that you make using simulation aren't going to be accurate either, right? And so this is really important that the technology works together and that information can be used to create accurate simulations as you're testing your changes. Brian, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I kind of just touch on the people and the technology side of this. Kind of going back to the fact that, we do observe on the desktop. So that gives us a human element, like you mentioned, as well as a technology in terms of which applications are being used. So, as part of that discover process, you were probably surprised. Almost everybody is surprised when they see some of that human element side. So human can mean cohorts, where we can break down people into, how well they perform on certain metrics. So you can start to see some of the differences between, you know, analytically what is a high performer and a lower performer and people in the middle. But you can also use that overlaid with technology. So technology is looking at how people switch between applications. So when we're designing these process simulations, again, there is a technology and application aspect. Certain systems should be used at each step of the process. But one of the benefits of understanding exactly how people work is a lot of times people are most often surprised at how often productivity apps are thrown into the mix because it really presents an opportunity to improve that process when you know that, for instance, people are copying and pasting to and from Excel, copying and pasting from OneNote. Maybe Outlook and Teams is in the mix a little more than you realized as people are collaborating through steps. So when you have those insights, it makes that design a lot more comprehensive and complete when you can say, all right, I know I need to eliminate, one of these copy and pastes. I need to eliminate this. So in a process perspective, you can say, all right, maybe it's a system improvement. As part of my design process, I'm also like, I know I need a system improvement. And you can start to identify some of those challenges. And I think that's a really important part of the people and technology side of this as you're simulating, as you're designing, you're getting ready to improve and you want to make some changes. So now you have that more complete picture. Then you can move on to that third phase.
And I think that level of detail or that level of granularity is pretty important, right? Because we have these the again, as you mentioned, Brian, like those big goals around
Mhm.
compliance or productivity or reducing costs. And you can say, okay, well, one level down, like these processes impact those goals, right? And then you go one level down, you say, okay, these process activities impact those goals. And then you go one level down and you say, like something that as small as like a copy and paste on the surface, you're like, that's not really going to have this outstanding impact on where we get to. But when you realize like that copy and paste might be exposing you to data privacy issues if it's the wrong data that's being copied and pasted, or if people need to find that Excel file and it's taking them forever to get the information they need, like that's having an impact on productivity. So when you have that level of insight and objective visibility, like something as small as a copy and paste could actually be the biggest driver that's preventing you from moving the needle. And I think that's again going back like why digital transformation has failed is like people weren't thinking about this from a process lens. They weren't thinking about it like that. They were like, we can just automate this and like that's going to solve all the problem. But you need to understand what the problem really is before you can do that, right?
Yeah, that understanding is crucial. So the last one, right? So optimize. Like, so you've discovered what you want to do. You've designed a solution, and now you've actually got to go try it, right? And this is obviously, the point where people hold their breath. This is the moment of truth. Did we design something that's going to be effective, lasting, meaningful? One of the huge benefits of our combined solution is this continuous monitoring process. So without having to do manual surveys and interviews and collect data in some, maybe some legacy ways of looking at single systems as across to entire process, that continuous monitoring is going to give you some real-time feedback. And being able to understand, iterate, and make changes really, kind of rapidly on the fly, is a really important part of how you create that lasting change. So that continuous monitoring piece, that's a huge part of, our combined solution and what you're really going to get at your fingertips to make, again, meaningful change, but also just understand if you're making the right change. Because guess what? Sometimes your change is not going to be the right change. And that's okay if you can understand it and iterate and pivot quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Um, Certainly, you can get like you can be using process simulation. You can be like reasonably sure that like you're directionally correct. But what happens when something comes up that you couldn't have possibly accounted for beforehand, right? Like what happens if in the middle of a 6 month change, a specific team that's important to that change gets laid off? Well, obviously, like this is going to cause a problem, but you need to be able to like assess that impact in real time and say like, how do we pivot from this? And I think one of the kind of key lessons learned that I've seen over the years is people think about improvement as these kind of ad hoc projects. Let's do that analysis, let's implement a change, and let's move on to the next thing. But the problem is, their scope creep over time. Like the problems gradually reintroduce themselves over time. People start doing some shadow IT things, going and using like something else that isn't standard, right? And if you don't know about that, you can't get ahead of it until it becomes a problem. So that monitoring aspect is super important to understand adoption of the change, to understand um to make sure that it's not going off the tracks. And maybe one other, maybe more uh fun might not be the right word, but I think it's kind of fun because monitoring by itself is, it is what it is. Um, is the what you can do with this data, right? If you have this monitoring data, it's not just saying like here's what's going, it's not just checking for what's going off track. You can actually use that data to feed more AI and machine learning, right? So we offer predictive analytics, and based on that ongoing stream of data, based on like what we're seeing in real time, we could predict, for instance, like if there is a certain pattern of activity across human operators, across systems, like if we got to a certain point, maybe this application is going to get through later than we think it is, and maybe we can get ahead of that. Or maybe this process is getting bogged down with false positives, so we know it's going to have a specific impact on how quickly or how many resources we need to use to filter through that selection criteria, right? So we can get smart, and instead of being reactive, this continuous monitoring actually enables us to be proactive because of the data it provides.
Yeah, and that proactive nature I think is really important. I'll kind of hit on that with a couple of the last points there. When we talk about risk mitigation and risk exposure in the banking and service industry, that rapid feedback is going to be really important there. Yeah, again, KYC has been a use case that keeps coming up more and more amongst this industry as not just US regulations, really global regulations are changing and people are really cracking down. That process monitoring right there is a pretty important one when you really want to tackle how we can mitigate risks, make sure non-compliant activities are being um, not just tracked, but also alerted upon is really important there. So between
Yeah,
that, audit ready reporting too.
I was gonna say audit's a big piece of that as well.
Yep.
I didn't even mention that, but when you have that ongoing stream of data, you can say, to internal audit or external audit, right? Like this is exactly how it's working. This is exactly what happened. Not only was the process designed this way, but here's the actual execution to prove that we're doing this the right way and that we are effectively mitigating our risk. Um, yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, so as we kind of look to, wrap up and wind down here, right? I mean, what does success look like? It kind of goes back to those key value drivers that we've been talking about, hopefully throughout the system and throughout this webinar, and you're getting a sense that, we really are driving towards tangible value that transformation leaders can show to the business. Because we want, you know, productivity is important and it means different things at different parts of the business. Contact center efficiency can be a little different than loan underwriting, efficiency. But the idea here still is that you're constantly decreasing handling times, and being able to empower your agents to do more, on their own. So some of that feeds into reducing costs. That obviously has implications on customer service here. But again, compliance being one of the big themes of the day here. Um, any ways that we can enhance that AML oversight process is huge, right? The human element on, bringing people in, reducing your fraud risk is such a critical part of that. And when you've got that complete picture, this is really where digital twins start to really create a significant advantage for companies, because it's not like this is a revenue generating source of the business, right? You've got to manage this to make sure you're not getting fined. You're staying within compliance. Your audits are up to date. So digital twins play a huge piece in increasing that audit readiness and increasing compliance at various steps of this, between the AML process holistically, but that KYC, know your customer part, especially upfront and ongoing refreshes, is really important part of where digital twins play a role here. Anything you want to add, Max?
No, I just want to. Yes, actually, sorry, I said no instinctively, but I see a question in the chat about
Mhm.
some of the. Let me read it exactly. Can you give some example bottlenecks that can be solved well in financial services? And I think this slide is a good slide to maybe answer that question at the same time. Where the point I wanted to make is The ultimate goal with these digital twins is to get a digital twin of the entire organization, right? You do want to be able to have that visibility across all of the different processes, across all of your operations, measured to all of the corporate strategies and goals that you have. But to find success, as with pretty much anything, right? You want to start smaller, prove value, get success, get more funding, get more excitement in an organization around this concept as you build it out. And so I think that this is all of these things are possible and all of them are important, right? That's the end goal, is that we improve all four categories here. But I think picking a specific point that you're focused on, whether it is that AML aspect that Brian just mentioned, or whether it is reducing the servicing times in your call centers, you want to focus on one of those issues and prove out that value and move on from there. And so if we want some examples of bottlenecks that could be improved, right? These are kind of the end goals, right? You want to reduce the cost of a service ticket. Well, how do you do that? One of the things you could do is, using this visibility, you can understand, is there a certain pattern with service tickets? Like, do specific types of requests or specific calls around specific topics consistently get elevated to a tier 2 support? That might be an opportunity to say, okay, maybe we need some more training here because the reps can the first line support agents just don't understand this concept well enough. Or maybe they do understand it well enough and they don't have the permission. Like, maybe the approval is actually the process to escalate is too restrictive. But either way, this ping ponging is having an impact on our CSAT scores, because like the customer wants their issue resolved as quickly as possible. They have to talk to more than one person. Obviously that's not making them happy. Or at like a really basic fundamental, one of the issues that we see across industries, but particularly in financial services, where there is more of like a legacy atmosphere around technology, generally speaking. Not to say that there aren't plenty of innovators and there is an adoption of new technology, but there is quite a bit of legacy. There's room for automation here, right? Especially for things that are manual activity, like Brian mentioned, copy and pasting, going back and forth, or even just something sitting somewhere for approval that you might be able to automate that approval workflow in certain instances. And so those are some examples of the bottlenecks. Obviously, for, I would say, any of the KPIs that you see here, there's probably like 3 or 4 root causes that we would say would typically lead to one of these KPIs not performing the way it should. And that's where, the experience of, actually, maybe this is probably a good way to transition to the next slide. I would say the experience of iGrafx and Skan comes in where we have experience doing this. We have experience doing this in financial services. And so it's not purely exploratory. It's not just, here's the tools, you can see everything and then start figuring out your own problems. We have some experience knowing what to look for, particularly in financial services, that would drag down those outcomes to, unacceptable levels. And I do think, this does bring us to the end of the webinar. So again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Brian and I would be more than happy to tackle them live here. But maybe just a closing remark before we jump into that Q&A, give people some time to put them in, is that, this digital twin concept for digital transformation is newer. Digital transformation isn't new. The digital twins are newer, right? There are some pioneers, iGrafx and Skan, like together, like we have experience doing this. We've proven success. Regardless of if you go with us or not, like, do your research, look at the analysts, look at the reviews online. Like, obviously Brian and I work for Skan and iGrafx. We're going to tell you that you should go with us because we know what we're doing, and we do, right? But do your research, look around and see what companies exist, who can help you out, and make sure you choose a reputable vendor, because the stakes here are too important to get this wrong. And the last thing you want to do is make an investment that isn't going to pan out, because that's the whole reason you need the digital twin in the first place, right? So do your research ahead of time. All right, looks like we do have some questions coming in.
This is a good one, right? So, kind of asking about where's the best place to start? How do we build, POCs to demonstrate value? This is a question we get a lot. I'm sure you guys get this one too, Max. I'll take a first crack at this one here. When we're looking at where you can demonstrate value, the more complex the process, the harder it is to get off the ground, right? So you're sort of looking for what is a process that's easy to understand and something that should be highly repetitive. And I say should be because if it was, you wouldn't be talking to us. So you're looking for something that has a high degree of predictability. A lot of times people start with processes that are pretty well defined to start with. So in banking, we see a lot in the claims process. Claims is such an important part of the business. So especially for insurance companies, the same with like loan underwriting. I mean, you've got pretty standard set of procedures for how it's supposed to occur. And it's an area that you can also quantify the value of taking some resolution time out of the process. So we see oftentimes a lot of people start there looking for some places to just add some automation where you maybe never looked at it. But typically, when you're trying to build value to start with, starting with kind of something that's an easier to understand process is usually where people get off the ground the fastest. You want to add anything there?
Yeah, no, I think that's that was pretty well answered. Maybe just one thought on the POC aspect of it a little bit more. Um, and trying to right size that specific investment. I would say you have there's two ways really to engage initially that I think are best. One would be more of a proof of concept where you could, play around with some digital twin technology, with some sample data, just get a feel for it. And then maybe that might spawn some ideas for where you want to look. Or you could do like a more dedicated proof of value, where Skan and iGrafx could come in, take a sample data set, do some analysis, and prove out that value before kind of making the next big jump. Um, I do think at the end of the day, one of the things that maybe is not coming to mind is, or that you might not be thinking of in terms of sizing it is there a person that cares about this, right? Like, is there a sponsor that it impacts their day to day, it impacts their performance and their incentives if this process isn't working the right way? Because having that support, and particularly if they touch like all the parts of the chunk that you're trying to break off, that's going to be invaluable for building that business case, right? Not just for them, but also for further investment past them. So identifying that champion, right sizing it, deciding on a POC versus POV, those are all things to consider, and also things that Brian and I would be happy to help walk through you with. I do have another question in that same vein, which is someone's working in operational resilience. How can I propose this to my wider team? Well, certainly going to have a webinar recording. You can share that. Brian and I are more than happy to jump on the call. We do deal with folks in the second line of defense all the time. Plenty of customers in risk and compliance teams where their focus is on audit and making sure that the controls are implemented effectively and that they're effectively mitigating the risks. So jumping on a call is probably the best way to do it. But without us, the question to ask is, how well do you think if these controls are actually working the way that we think they are? And if they give you an answer that is anything other than something backed by data and is more of a gut feel or more of what people are saying is going on, you can highlight the fact that without actually understanding what's happening on the ground across the systems and people, they shouldn't be as confident as they think they are, and that there actually is potential for hidden risk that they might be missing.
And I'll just add on to that. I think the data side is a really important part to highlight because really what separates our approach to solving this problem really does start with the data side of it. I mean, that complete view is such an important aspect of it. If you're only looking at a single system, you're not actually seeing how people work. So I think Max is right. I mean, poke around, ask people, if they really do understand, step by step, application by application, do they really know how, a certain team operates? Because chances are they are probably guessing to a degree. So you're trying to take the guesswork out of this.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Brian, is there another one you want to?
Yeah, someone asked about how we quantify the value of process optimization. I think value metrics is always a really important one. I mean, both of our systems are very analytical. So, being able to simulate isn't just simulating time spent at current processes, it's also being able to simulate what's the value of that time saved as well. So, the value depends on the process in the system. We see a lot of handling times, processing time, resolution time. Those are typically what we see as value metrics that people are trying to quantifiably affect because it's very measurable. It's measurable at every step of the way, not just when it opens to when it closes, but part of identifying bottlenecks is looking at the time spent at each individual step. Because when you see an abnormal amount of time spent at a given step, you obviously know you have something to change. So that can typically be quantified in terms of, either salaries, revenue, cost takeout. Um, but that's part of any process, I think, of understanding, not just process, but as you get off the ground, proof of value, proof of concept. It's also what's the value, from an ROI perspective. We're always looking at, what's that going to mean to the business.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Um, who do you think your competition is in the market, and how successful have they been in driving the importance of digital twins? I think that honestly, it's probably again because we will probably have biased opinions here, given that we're hosting the webinar. I think the best idea here is to work with the analyst, and definitely like the more respected analysts in the industry, people like Gartner, people like Forrester, see what they have to say about digital twins, and particularly digital twins of organizations, because that's really the type of digital twin that we're looking at here. There's some other types of digital twins, like in manufacturing, digital twins for, physical assets like wind turbines and things like that. But, obviously this is a different type of digital twin here that we're dealing with. So again, yeah, I'd say do some research. There are a bunch of different facets to digital twins, a bunch of different capabilities. Some competitors have some of those capabilities. Some competitors have all of them. Some have experience, some don't. So I would say in terms of the concept, it's here. It's definitely front and center. We are in prime time right now. But in terms of how you really want to make that evaluation, definitely do your research is what I would say.
I can start with that last question too. This last one is about Gen AI adoption. How do we make sure digital twins, provide an ROI and as well as governance in that too? This is an area that we're seeing customers increasingly ask us about, and that's not specific to banking and financial. I mean, this is pretty much across the board here. One of the areas that we use this digital twin concept is helping you understand what parts of your process are right for either automation or generative AI. And I don't want to use them interchangeably, but you're still looking for some kind of a technology assist at certain parts of the process. So if you want to make sure it has an ROI, you're looking for something that's highly repeatable, highly automatable, and something that can learn. And learning involves data. So what can you teach a generative AI solution, right? So you got to have some information about how things are supposed to work, whether that is just something data-based or working towards like a next best action type of recommendation. The governance side, that's where continuous monitoring is a really important part of this. So you're not just looking at what people are asking for help on, you're also looking at the actual help they can get. Being able to run different types of AI analysis, like natural language recognition, is a big piece of how you can make sure that there is a governance aspect of it so you can actually see exactly what's going on when it's used at specific steps of the process. So being able to analyze, not just where it's right for use, but how it affects actual process usage, how it affects people. That's kind of the next part of governance, but you can't do any of that without that continuous monitoring aspect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd add one more element to governance that we didn't cover in detail as we were walking through the how it works, but in the Process 360 Live platform, where you're storing all the models of those processes and all the business objects that they're related to. That's really kind of that source of truth for training employees and making sure people have access to the information. There's a set of governance cycles built in. So you can say every 6 months, every year, the process owner has to go in and approve and say, this is how we want work to be done. There's also governance cycles to say, if you're an actual operator, so if you're an individual person sitting in a call center, you acknowledge and endorse that this is the process and that this is the process that I will follow. And that trail of what's changing, who has approved it, who's reviewed it, who has consulted, who's endorsed it, that you can set on an automatic frequency basis to get those updates. That's really important, not only for adoption purposes, but also, again, going back to audit, to being able to say, I have a record that people have looked at this and that they understand and have certified that this is how they're executing the process. So, yeah, just another important piece about governance there. And I think that's the last question we had. So I think we're just about done here. I just want to say thank you again. Thank you again, Brian, for being on. So happy to do this. Can't wait for the next one. Thank you to
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you to everyone who attended. Again, we'll send out the recording afterwards. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Brian or I. We'd be happy to talk more about it. If you're trying to make a business case internally with different people, we're happy to help you think through that as well. We've done that a million times. So appreciate everyone attending today. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.